Our next speaker is Peter Bolt. Peter has 40 years of caving and cave diving experience and remains an active caver. The highlights of his caving experience include the discovery of Ogof Draenen. If you aren't familiar with that, that's one of the longest and deepest caves in the UK. It's found in South Wales. It's a spectacular trip. Ogof Draenen is now over 70 kilometers long. Peter was a diver who was involved in diving the Lake of the White Roses in 1992, and he's going to talk about his work there.
You've got my voice on the screen now, have you?
Yep, you look great.
Thank you very much. Let me start up. Right, the expedition was in 1992, and we had a team of cavers from the USA, Canada, and obviously the UK. And with the support of John Swain and Jim Brown, I also had the use of 5,000 PSI Accurex bottles. I don't know if they're still in existence because they'll be quite old now, but they were ultra lightweight tanks developed, I believe, for the Apollo space missions. The British team had all taken part in the exploration of Darren, which is a cave in South Wales, where for 10 years we'd camped underground for exploration. The camp was some 5 hours into the cave, and the digs were a further 2 hours from the camp. It was then, and it still is today, the most remote part of a British cave. The diving started in Florida. For me, I spent a week with Tom Morris and then was driven over to New Mexico by Jim Brown. And once at Lechuguilla, we began to carry trips to the base of Araga Nightmare, which is where this photo was taken, which was our first staging post. And once ready, a small team of 4 of us ferried the equipment up the pitch, which we thought would take most of the day. But in practice, we carried up 4 tackle bags each in one go. So we only needed to do 1 trip each. And then we ferried the bags one at a time across the China room. For those of you who are not that familiar with the cave, the Lake of the White Roses is approximately where the red circle is. The following day, the diving party, which was some 9 cavers in 2 groups, entered Lechuguilla Cave. This included David Eck and Kathy Chauvin of the National Park, and also Louise Hose had joined us for this stage. At Araga Nightmare, more bags were taken up and on, and before the second group had caught up, the first group had moved everything to Grand Guadalupe Junction, which is where we set up camp. This is Andy, who was the camp cook in Darren for us. If you like vegetarian food, he's a chef at it. And you can see we were quite well supplied for the camp at Grand Guadalupe Junction. I believe things are a lot leaner these days. So on day 7, what was day 7 of the expedition? There's Grand Guadalupe Junction. Day 7 of the expedition had 4 diving equipment bags, some water sampling bottles, some food, and a piss pot descending the 1,000 feet to the Lake of the White Roses. The route down is one of the few sections of the cave where mineral formations are almost non-existent. There are, however, some areas with numerous very large and very old looking calcite rafts in the floor, particularly in Ruby Chamber, which is where you access the Lake of the White Roses rift from. On the day of the dive, a small team ferried the diving equipment down from Ruby Chamber to the White Roses. And the first activity, as you see here, was Louise Hose taking water samples from the only accessible part of the lake. This is not the dive site because the rift pinches down in the lake, although it does connect into the rest of the lake. The diving route into the Lake of White Roses is via a narrow body-sized tube at water level. And through this, you could look down about 20 feet through very crystal clear water. I was at this point 2 years previously, and the water would have been up level with Rich in the red below me there in the photo, just above the top of the squeeze. And on this visit for the dive, the water level had dropped about 2.5 feet. And it meant I was able to get through the squeeze and have my equipment passed down to me and kit up in the sump. You can just about make out some bits in there, which is me. Kitting up took some time. I'd washed down at the camp that morning and I wiped down once again at the lake. And my diving equipment had all been thoroughly cleaned while it was still in Florida. This is the actual point where you can get through into the water. This is me in the water, and the water is so clear that I can't actually see the water in this photograph. This is photographed by Louise Hose. So I began a gradual descent of the rift, working my way down between the walls. I was taking water samples for Louise every 5 feet. And the final sample was taken at 20 feet where I abandoned the sampling tubes, deciding that it was all a bit too cumbersome to dive, lay line, and carry on exploring at the same time. The floor of the rift had closed, and off to the west, much to my relief, the rift continued gradually descending and passably wide. There are some squeezes at the start to the point where I wondered if that was the end of the dive because they were quite tight. Most of the calcite foliations on the walls had disappeared by now, and the floor was covered in small sharp-edged potholes filled with sunken calcite rafts. And some of these rafts are up to 6 inches in diameter, and that's much the same as I'd seen, but in Ruby Chamber above. But the ones in Ruby Chamber are obviously very, very old compared to these. Below me, the east wall of the rift was pinched out, forming a floor. And with the rift pinch out below and too tight above, I was guided along and down, at no time certain if this was all about to end abruptly. At minus 50 feet, the rift widened to 3 to 4 feet wide and leveled off to the west, and I could see as far as my light would shine along it. I chose to stay in the rift, and I continued to descend. With the occasional squeeze, I ended up at about 85-foot depth, where I could see both ends of the rift, both the east wall and the west wall coming in beneath me. And then a slightly tighter squeeze had me squeezing down feet first until I was stopped. And the floor was about 10 foot below me where both east and west walls joined. And in the northern wall, there was a slight lip in the wall that I couldn't see past, which possibly is a way on, but I somewhat doubt it. And if it is the way on, then it's probably only body size to get through it. So the deepest point I reached was minus 92 feet, or 1,604 feet in the cave. And it looked closed 10 foot below. But even at this point, the calcite rafts had managed to tumble all the way down the eastern edge of the rift. So they've obviously been bouncing up, the water level must have been bouncing up and down in this rift historically over the years. I was pleased that I still had an open lead at the 50-foot level. So I returned up and then began to follow this rift along. The walls are now brown limestone with the floor incredibly well potholed. And a piece breaking off in my hand showed that the color was only superficial because there was still white limestone beneath. After 60 feet, I crossed an inviting 5-foot diameter vertical pothole in the floor. And then 10 feet further, I entered a very welcome chamber, 30 feet long and about 15 feet wide. Unfortunately, there's no obvious way out, and the euphoria I was feeling along the 50-foot level began to fade a bit. At the entrance to the chamber, the rift was wide enough to follow upwards, and through this I reached 2 air bells above. These were choked, but they were also covered in the sandy-colored calcite foliations that occur at the Lake of the White Roses. Returning back down into the chamber, I began to survey back out. At the pothole in the floor, I crossed and then dropped down to to the bottom of the pothole at about minus 70 feet. There is a way on visible through the bottom through a tight bedding squeeze into a small chamber beyond that you can't see the floor of. But the squeeze is probably only 6 or 7 inches high. And I don't even think in the dry I could get through that. And other cavers might struggle when it's dry. On the way back up, my line reel jammed. And because it was an enclosed type of line reel, I was forced just to wrap it around itself and gradually work my way back out to surface. I didn't dive a second time. I thought I'd pretty well closed off the going leads or what was going to go in that sump. A benefit from this expedition was that after diving in Florida and using the American style of side mounts, I adopted it back in the UK. And within 1 to 2 years, pretty well all other British cave divers had also changed over to this system compared to the British system that we'd used previously. And I'd still like to thank the National Park for their support given for this dive, particularly Dale Pate, whom I'm very pleased to see is attending today. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, hold on. There's the lake after the dive. This is where Louise took her samples from. There are still some calcite rafts floating in the water. You'll be pleased to see. And this is the water level historically in the Lake of the White Roses provided to me by Paul Berger. You can see it fell very consistently for the first 10 years of known point of the cave. It's falling at about 1.5 feet per year. And then for some reason it seems to be static, and I don't know if that's correct. But if the water level continues to fall at 1.5 feet a year, then in about 20 or 30 years more, you'll be able to get to the bottom of the sump while being dry. So does anybody have any questions?
Peter, you have a question in the chat box. Why was the water level falling that quickly?
It could be something to do with water extraction for Carlsbad and the oil industry in the region.
Okay, thanks. Next question. Did you smell
Quite a
any?
dramatic rate of fall.
So next question, if you're ready, Peter, is did you smell any hydrogen sulfide? Did you see any bacteria?
No, not underwater, no. There was nothing. The water was absolutely crystal clear, typical classic Lechugear style.
Okay, thanks. Next question. Has the water level change been correlated with other pools in the cave?
I don't know about that. There are other people you should ask. I suspect that the water level here is the groundwater table indicator here. The water table here in Lake of the White Roses has risen with flood events in the past, with heavy rainfall events at surface in the past. But how hydraulically connected it is, I don't know. But I suspect, being limestone, everything's interconnected.
Okay, thanks. Next question. That seems such a huge group to support one diver. How many tanks did you bring, or was there lots of extra gear?
It ended up as quite a big team. It wasn't the original head. The team could have been a lot smaller. They weren't all underground at the same time. The main part of the flow was getting equipment to Moraga Nightmare, and that was done relatively swiftly because you'd have a group coming in the morning and a group going in the afternoon. And for the dive itself, the team, as I said, the team that went to Grand Guadalupe Junction was 9. And then the actual team that was down at the Lake of the White Roses was 5 of us.
Right, next question. How long was the dive itself underwater?
Ooh, about 40 minutes to an hour. It was comparatively short.
Okay, and again from the chat box, wow, what a cool transfer of knowledge to have this diving experience influence diving techniques in the UK. What were some of the UK divers' initial impressions of your experience diving in the Lake of the White Roses?
Oh, I think people were quite jealous, obviously, that I'd been to Letchagea Cave. I was stunned at the American side mount system, at how well it worked, how flexible it was, and just how adaptable it was. I would have had real trouble getting into the sump in the Lake of the White Roses without using it if I'd tried to use the British system, which is where the two tanks are clamped, physically clamped onto your diving belt. It makes it very difficult. And what really surprised me is that quite a few other British cave divers had been out to Florida before me and dived extensively with your fellow Americans, and none of them had come back to Britain and used it. But it is de facto standard nowadays in the UK.
Okay, thanks. And I want to point out to folks that are asking questions about the water levels that there's some information being typed in the chat box around that question. Peter, there's one more question. Where are the loggers installed? I think this is in reference to your slide here. And what is the minimum level they can measure?
I have no idea. Paul Berger might be able to give you a better answer on that.
Sounds good. And I think that that's one that maybe our hosts and folks can put some additional information in the chat box there for folks. If somebody has that answer. I know Paul is with us this morning.